March 7, 1945. 3:50 in the afternoon. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen stands gray and defiant against the winter sky, its iron girders streaked with rain and the residue of hasty demolition charges. The Rhine River churns below, dark, cold, perpetual, a natural fortress that has protected Germanic lands since the legions of Rome learned its unforgiving currents. On the eastern bank, Oberleutnant Hans Schelling of the 67th Army Corps crouches behind a concrete pillbox, his fingers numb around the grip of his Mauser. He can hear the distant rumble now, that peculiar mechanical thunder that has haunted German defenders from Normandy to the Siegfried Line. But here at the Rhine it should not matter. Here, the river itself is Germany's guardian. Here, the Americans should be stopped. They are not stopped. Schelling watches through his field glasses as the first American infantrymen, small as insects from this distance, sprint across the bridge's western approach. Behind them, impossibly, come the tanks. Not the light reconnaissance vehicles he might have expected for a hasty bridge assault, but the full-weight M4 Shermans, 30 tons of steel and purpose rolling across a structure the Germans had spent 3 days trying to destroy. The bridge groans audibly even from Schelling's position. The demolition charges had detonated. He had felt the concussion in his chest, had seen the smoke and debris fountain skyward, yet the bridge had merely shuddered and held. Now American armor crosses the Rhine as if the river were nothing more than a tributary stream, as if 1,000 years of German defensive doctrine had evaporated in an afternoon. He cannot understand it. None of them can. The Rhine was not merely a river. In the winter of 1945, as the Third Reich contracted like a fist around its heartland, the Rhine represented the final geographical barrier between Allied armies and the industrial core of Germany. From Switzerland to the North Sea, it carved a liquid trench through Western Europe, broad, fast-flowing, unbridged in most places after systematic German demolitions. Every Wehrmacht general, every Waffen-SS commander, every exhausted Volksgrenadier knew the strategic arithmetic. Hold the Rhine, and perhaps the war might be prolonged, perhaps the miracle weapons might arrive, perhaps the Western Allies and Soviets might fracture in mutual suspicion. Lose the Rhine and Germany's heartland lay exposed, its factories vulnerable, its cities open to encirclement. The Germans had prepared accordingly. Fortifications lined the eastern bank, concrete bunkers, artillery positions, interlocking fields of fire calibrated to turn any river crossing into a slaughter. Every bridge had been wired for demolition, every ferry scuttled, every ford surveyed and ranged by mortar teams. The defensive plans were thorough, detailed, informed by centuries of military thought. The Rhine had stopped the Romans at the height of their power. It would stop the Americans in their moment of industrial excess. This was the belief. This was the calculation that allowed Wehrmacht officers to sleep, however briefly, in the chaos of March 1945. But the calculation was predicated on assumptions about warfare that the Americans had systematically dismantled across 8 months of combat from Normandy to the German frontier. The German military mind, trained in economy of force and operational elegance, could not fully comprehend the sheer material abundance that American industry had placed at the disposal of its field commanders. To cross a river, any river, much less the Rhine, required pontoon bridges, specialized equipment, careful coordination of engineers and infantry and artillery. It required time. It required accepting that the first waves would suffer catastrophic casualties. It required a willingness to pause, to consolidate, to treat the river as a serious obstacle demanding serious respect. The Americans did not pause. They did not consolidate. They treated the Rhine not as an insurmountable barrier, but as an inconvenience to be solved through the application of overwhelming material resources. Schelling lowers his field glasses, his hands trembling now from something beyond cold. Across the bridge, more Shermans roll forward, and behind them he can see the dark shapes of half-tracks, supply trucks, tank destroyers, an entire armored column pouring across the river as if the Rhine were nothing more than a backdrop in a training exercise. His artillery battalion had been promised reinforcements. They had not arrived. His unit had been promised air support to destroy the bridge. The Luftwaffe had not appeared. What remained was his company, undersupplied and exhausted, facing an enemy that seemed to operate by entirely different rules of logistics and possibility. The German soldier of March 1945 carried with him a profound understanding of scarcity. He knew hunger intimately, not the dramatic starvation propaganda, but the constant, grinding insufficiency that wore down judgment and endurance. His rations had been cut repeatedly since the winter of 1944. The black bread was coarser, adulterated with sawdust and potato flour. The ersatz coffee was barely color water. The cigarettes, when available, were harsh Turkish tobacco mixed with weeds. His uniform was threadbare, patched with material from fallen comrades. His boots, if he was fortunate enough to have intact boots, were held together with wire and scavenged leather. The trucks that should have brought ammunition and food had no fuel. The fuel that existed went to the tanks, and the tanks had no spare parts, and the spare parts that existed went to units defending more critical sectors. This was the reality of the Wehrmacht in 1945, a military force still capable of tactical excellence, still dangerous in defense, but operating on the ragged edge of material collapse. The American soldier who crossed the Rhine carried a different reality in his pack. Schelling would learn this in the weeks that followed, first through rumor, then through direct observation, finally through the bitter experience of surrender and captivity. The American infantrymen carried rations that seemed to Schelling's men like fantasy: canned meat, canned fruit, chocolate bars, cigarettes in neat waterproof packets, instant coffee that actually tasted like coffee. The American soldier threw away food that a German squad would have considered a feast. He discarded ammunition that a Wehrmacht unit would have hoarded like treasure. His uniform was thick, well-made, replaced without question when damaged. His boots were leather, properly sized, fitted with insoles. He rode into combat more often than he walked, sparing his feet and his endurance for the actual business of fighting. Behind this individual soldier stood a logistical apparatus of such magnitude that German officers, even those who had studied American industrial capacity in peacetime, found themselves unable to fully grasp its implications during combat. The crossing at Remagen was improvised, unplanned, a target of opportunity, seized by alert junior officers. Yet within 48 hours of its capture, American engineers had constructed 2 pontoon bridges adjacent to the damaged rail bridge. Within 72 hours, 6 pontoon bridges spanned the Rhine at Remagen. Within a week, those bridges supported a traffic flow that exceeded the capacity of Germany's entire remaining rail network west of Berlin. Oberst Friedrich von Schroeder, Chief of Staff for the German 7th Army, recorded in his diary on March 12, 1945, reconnaissance reports indicate the Americans are moving 12,000 vehicles per day across the Rhine at Remagen. This figure cannot be correct. It exceeds our entire motor pool for the Western Front. Yet our artillery observers confirm continuous traffic, day and night. Where do they get the petrol? Where do they get the vehicles? How is this possible? It was possible because the United States, protected by 2 oceans from the destruction that had ravaged Europe and Asia, had converted its vast industrial infrastructure into a military production apparatus unprecedented in human history. American factories in 1944 produced more military equipment than all other combatant nations combined. The Chrysler tank arsenal in Detroit alone manufactured more tanks in 1944 than the entire German tank industry produced in the same year. American shipyards launch more tonnage in a single month than Germany built in an entire year. This was not military genius or tactical innovation. This was industrial physics, the simple application of overwhelming material resources to achieve objectives that would otherwise require tactical elegance or operational brilliance. The Germans had prepared for an enemy constrained by European norms of scarcity and logistical friction. They encountered instead an enemy for whom logistical abundance had become a weapon more devastating than any tactical doctrine. General Major Otto Hitzfeld, commander of the LXVI Corps defending the Remagen sector, expected the American crossing to bog down in the careful orchestration that river assaults traditionally required. Instead, within 3 days of capturing the bridge, the Americans had pushed a salient 15 kilometers deep on the Rhine's eastern bank. Hitzfeld's defensive positions, carefully prepared and mutually supporting, were simply bypassed or overwhelmed. His counterattacks, launched with the few mobile reserves he could scrape together, evaporated against walls of American artillery fire directed by spotter planes that seemed to orbit constantly overhead. He requested air support to destroy the bridges. The Luftwaffe, what remained of it, was husbanding its strength for the defense of Berlin. He requested reinforcements. None came. What arrived instead was a directive from OKW, the German High Command, declaring the bridge's recapture to be of decisive importance and holding Hitzfeld personally responsible for its loss. The disconnect between the German High Command's expectations and the reality on the ground had become total. In Berlin, in the Führer bunker, the maps still showed neat defensive lines, reserve divisions ready for deployment, counterattacks that would restore the situation. On the Rhine's eastern bank, German soldiers discovered that those reserve divisions existed only on paper, that the defensive lines crumbled under the weight of American firepower, that the counterattacks melted away before they could even reach their jump-off points. The material disparity manifested in ways both vast and intimate. American tanks moved forward with confidence because fuel trucks followed close behind, because spare parts arrived by air if necessary, because broken vehicles could be recovered and repaired rather than abandoned. German tanks advanced cautiously, rationing fuel, knowing that a breakdown meant permanent loss, that spare parts existed only as components scavenged from other wrecks. American infantry called in artillery support with casual confidence, knowing that the shells would come, that fire missions would be answered within minutes. German infantry hoarded their mortar ammunition, fired only when targets were certain, learned to endure American bombardments because their own artillery had fallen silent for lack of shells. The psychology of abundance versus scarcity shaped battlefield behavior in profound ways. Sergeant James Delmont of the 9th Armored Division, whose platoon was among the first to cross the Ludendorff Bridge, recalled in a 1983 interview, "We knew we had them. Not because we were better soldiers, some of those German kids fought hard as anyone I ever saw, but because we had everything and they had nothing. We could waste ammunition on suppressing fire. We could call in air strikes for a single machine gun nest. We could afford to take the cautious approach because we had the supplies to sustain it. They couldn't afford anything. Every bullet they fired was precious. Every man they lost couldn't be replaced. You could see it in their eyes when they surrendered, not fear, exactly, but this kind of exhausted disbelief. Like they'd been fighting something they couldn't beat not because it was skilled, but because it was inexhaustible." This sense of facing an inexhaustible enemy pervaded German accounts from the Rhine campaign. Lieutenant Werner Mork, a platoon leader in the 9th Panzer Division committed to counterattacks against the Remagen bridgehead, wrote to his wife on March 15th, "We attack with 11 tanks. The Americans meet us with 50. We destroy 5 of theirs, lose 4 of our own, withdraw. The next day they attack with 70 tanks. With 5 destroyed tanks where there are now 7. They do not seem to care what we destroy. It grows back like weeds in a garden that has infinite seeds. We cannot win this. The mathematics are impossible." The mathematics were indeed impossible. But what made the mathematics impossible was not merely numerical superiority. The Wehrmacht had faced numerical inferiority before and compensated through tactical skill and operational art. What made the mathematics impossible was the systematic elimination of logistical friction as a limiting factor in American operations. German commanders planned their attacks around carefully husbanded fuel reserves, knowing that a mobile operation might burn through a week's supply in a single day. American commanders planned their attacks with the confidence that fuel would arrive, that if rail lines were cut, trucks would carry it, that if trucks were insufficient, transport planes would deliver it directly to forward airstrips. This confidence enabled an operational tempo that German defenders found impossible to counter. The traditional rhythm of warfare, attack, consolidate, resupply, attack again, no longer applied. American forces attacked and continued attacking, pausing only when they outran their supply lines, then resuming immediately when those supply lines caught up. The Remagen bridgehead expanded not in the careful, methodical way that German doctrine anticipated, but in a cascading flood of men and material that simply absorbed losses and continued advancing. By March 16th, 9 days after the initial crossing, the Remagen bridgehead had expanded to encompass nearly 800 square kilometers of German territory. 4 American divisions had crossed the Rhine with their full complement of armor and artillery. German counterattacks had accomplished nothing beyond adding to the Wehrmacht's casualty lists. The Ludendorff Bridge itself, damaged by German demolition charges, weakened by American traffic, and subjected to constant German artillery fire, collapsed on March 17th, killing 28 American engineers working on its repair. The Rhine crossings marked the moment when this exhaustion became undeniable, when the material disparity became so obvious that even ideological commitment could not obscure it. German armies west of the Rhine had been supplied, however inadequately. German armies east of the Rhine were simply starving, immobile, disintegrating not through battlefield defeat, but through logistical collapse. The crossing itself was the inflection point, the moment when geography failed to compensate for material inferiority, when the last psychological barrier between American armies and Germany's heartland dissolved. In the years after the war, as historians and military analysts studied the Rhine campaign, the question arose repeatedly: why had German defensive planning failed so completely? The fortifications were substantial, the geography favorable, the defending forces still capable of serious resistance. Yet the defenses collapsed in weeks rather than months, and American casualties were moderate rather than catastrophic. The answer lay not in any single tactical or operational failure, but in the accumulated effect of material exhaustion meeting material abundance. German defenders had been promised reinforcements that did not exist, supplied by logistics networks that had collapsed, supported by an air force that was grounded for lack of fuel, fed by agricultural regions that were starving themselves. American attackers operated with the confidence that comes from knowing that supplies will arrive, that air support was available, that wounded soldiers would receive immediate medical care, that broken equipment would be repaired or replaced. This confidence enabled aggressive tactics that would have been reckless under conditions of scarcity. American commanders could afford to take risks because failed attacks could be repeated with fresh supplies and reinforcements. German commanders could not afford risks because failed attacks meant permanent loss of irreplaceable resources. The psychological impact of this disparity was as significant as its material effects. German defenders fought knowing that each loss weakened them permanently, while American attackers fought knowing that each loss would be replaced. The Rhine thus became a symbol of a larger truth about industrial warfare, that material abundance is itself a form of military power as significant as tactical doctrine or operational art. The Americans did not cross the Rhine through tactical brilliance. Their tactics were often crude by German standards. They crossed through the systematic application of overwhelming material resources, enough engineering equipment to build multiple bridges, enough artillery to suppress defensive fires, enough armor to absorb losses and continue advancing, enough logistics to sustain operations indefinitely. General Major Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Walter Model during the Rhine campaign, summarized this in his post-war analysis. We calculated what was militarily possible based on our own capabilities and constraints. The Americans demonstrated that our calculations were irrelevant because they operated without the constraints we assumed were universal. They could build bridges at rates we considered impossible. They could sustain offensives at tempos we believed were unsustainable. They could absorb casualties and material losses that would have crippled German operations. This was not because American soldiers were supermen or American generals were geniuses. It was because the American military operated with material abundance so profound that it changed the fundamental rules of what was militarily possible. The Rhine stands now in memory as the river that did not hold, the barrier that did not protect, the defensive line that collapsed not through any single catastrophic failure, but through the steady application of industrial power, greater than anything German military planners had imagined possible. The American tanks crossed because behind those tanks stood factories and farms and oil wells and mines, and continental economy mobilized for war. And against such power, the Rhine was merely water, and the fortifications merely concrete, and the defenders merely men exhausted and starving, and without the materials necessary to resist. In the evening of March 7, 1945, as darkness fell over the Ludendorff Bridge, and the first American tanks reached the Rhine's eastern bank, Oberleutnant Hans Schelling remained at his post, firing methodically at targets he could barely see, knowing with certainty now that the position would not hold, that reinforcements would not arrive, that this was not a temporary setback, but the beginning of the end. He thought of the Rhine's long history, the legions it had stopped, the armies it had turned back, the centuries during which its waters had protected Germanic lands. All of that history meant nothing against an enemy who could bridge the unbridgeable simply by having enough materials and enough determination to use them. The river still flowed, dark and cold and eternal. But it no longer protected anything. The Americans had crossed, and behind them came a tide of steel and fuel and food and ammunition that would not stop until it reached Berlin and beyond. The Rhine had become, in a single afternoon, merely one more river among many, a geographic feature rendered strategically irrelevant by industrial abundance, so overwhelming that geography itself ceased to matter. This was the lesson written in steel and concrete and exhausted faces of German prisoners, that in industrial war between modern states, material abundance ultimately triumphs over tactical skill, that logistics is strategy, that the side which can waste resources carelessly will defeat the side that must husband them carefully. The American soldier who threw away half a chocolate bar was not expressing contempt or cruelty. He was expressing a material reality in which chocolate bars were essentially infinite, in which waste was possible because abundance was assured. That chocolate bar, discarded and remembered, became the symbol more powerful than any bridge or tank or artillery barrage. It represented an enemy operating by different rules of possibility, an adversary whose power came not from superior ideology or racial destiny, but from farms and factories, and an economic system that produced more than could easily be consumed. Against such power, the Rhine was merely water, and courage was merely courage, and the end was simply a matter of time and arithmetic. The bridges held. The Americans crossed. And Germany learned too late that in modern war, abundance is destiny, and scarcity is defeat, and no amount of will or skill can substitute for the simple, overwhelming power of industrial democracy fully mobilized for conflict. This was the truth the Rhine revealed in March 1945, not dramatic or heroic, but final and absolute as the river's cold current flowing uselessly toward sea it could no longer protect.